All right, friends, we'll spend the next few minutes talking about identity. And before we really get started, I should probably acknowledge that we're going to give 10 or 12 minutes to a topic of study and conversation that has spanned the last many decades, that has spawned numerous books and dissertations and articles and conversations and arguments. So, over the next few minutes, we're not going to really do much other than scratch the surface of it. But I do want to put some key ideas and topics on the table because as we get into sexuality, you really can't pull apart or you really can't talk fully about sexuality unless you also have some sense of identity formation because that is such an important part of the adolescent experience, the adolescent journey. So we are going to talk some about that for the next few minutes. I had you watch that rather silly introductory video. It does, in fact, bring up some of the highlights of Ericksonian identity development theory and the fact that there's this, what he used, the term he uses as a crisis that goes on in the lives of an adolescent where they're trying to figure out who they are. And that's really a significant part of what it means to be a teenager as we talk about youth ministry and our job as youth leaders or as those who are supporting youth leaders or teens in churches. This is the dramatic task, the dramatic, decisive question of what it means to be a teenager is who in the world am I? And so we want to spend just a few minutes talking about that. Some thoughts from some of the readings that you've done. This quote comes from James Marcia, who's one of the great thinkers in identity, but it's cited in the Jacober reading from chapter 3 of her book. And by the way, I know that reading in chapter 3 of the Jacober book is a little intense and fairly theoretical, but it gets a lot of the really good players and conversationalists in identity and especially identity theory among Christian thinkers on the table. So I want to put that out there for you. So I hope you got something out of that. So Marcia says that identity refers to a coherent sense of one's meaning to oneself and to others within that social context. So to begin with, what our identity is, and particularly in the lives of a teenager, what identity is trying to figure out how I matter in the world, how I matter to myself, and how I matter to the people that are in my social world. Right. So that's at its heart. That's the kind of the core task of being a teenager or being a young adult is answering this question: who am I? And along with who am I, what do I do? Where do I live? Who do I connect with, etc. So it's never an isolated task. It's never a task that is only done in a vacuum or only refers to myself. I'm always defining myself, or we're always defining ourselves in relation to the people around us, because who the most important people in our lives think we are, say we are, or implicitly tell us that we are, that also is a huge part of shaping our identity. And so it is both of those things. It's the meaning that I make of myself to myself, as well as how I at least understand others to identify or explain my presence in this world also. He goes on to say the sense of identity suggests an individual's continuity with the past, a personally meaningful present, and a direction for the future. And so part of that statement right there, or one of the real meaningful parts of that statement, is it gets at the idea that identity develop isn't a task that is completed. You don't do it for a couple of years or for a little while and then it's over and I figured out who I am. While it's most acute and most central to the adolescent and young adult years, your identity is something that you're working on your whole life. And all of you, I'm sure, can recognize that and understand that no matter how old you are, what stage of life that you're in, there's always still a sense of continuing to ask that question of who am I and what am I doing here, and how does who I am now relate to who I was before, and how does it set a course for who I may be in the future. And so there's also a time continuum element of identity where we continue to try to figure out who I am relative to where I have been and where I am going. And then Jacob herself hits on this idea of individuation, which is usually psychologically or in the world of psychology, the primary task, the way we speak of the primary task of adolescence and of the teenage years and young adult years as well. But trying to figure out how I'm going to be myself. As you all know, children grow up and a lot of their identity as children comes from their parents. Our faith largely comes from our parents' faith. Our thoughts about the world largely come from our parents' thoughts and views on the world. But as we move through our teen years, we start to really try to think about, really wrestle with the question of, all right, separate from my parents and separate from the home I grew up in, who am I? And how do I understand myself? And so it begins, again, what Jacob refers to as a lifelong process, just this continual question, it's a continual task of asking, who am I and how do I recognize my individuality in the world? Okay. Jacob also says it's not an isolated journey. It's not something you do by yourself, but the really tricky thing with that statement is that teens will tell you it feels incredibly isolated. And so, in the one sense, it can't be. We can't really define ourselves apart from others or in a vacuum that separates us from the people around us. On the other hand, with the number and the ferocity of thoughts and feelings and emotions and hormones running through the body of a teen and a young adult, we can't help but feel as though we are all by ourselves. We'll talk more about that when we get into some of the questions of teaching sexuality well and understanding sexuality well. Um, but we can't help but feel like we are by ourselves. Okay? On the other hand, there are the social structures around us are actually heavily influential on us, and that's an important part of our sexual development and sexual identity as well. Is that we do learn things from our environments. We're not a product of strict genetic influence. We are highly and heavily and continually influenced by the structures of the world around us, our homes, our communities, our schools, our friend groups, um, in both good and in at times very, very poor, very detrimental ways. So while we may feel as though our identity development is this incredibly, almost isolatingly or entirely isolatingly personal thing, it is in fact not at all that way. It is in fact our identity is developed in concert with and through the influence of a massive number of external forces as well. Um, Ideally, as Jacober says there toward the bottom half, the adolescent will move from childhood to adulthood and make connections um, with their community as well as with the eternal, as well as with God. We started this module in Galatians 2:20 for exactly that reason. That part of what we know, and she says that youth ministers have the privilege of walking along this journey with adolescents. Part of what we know that they need so badly to know is that they don't have to define themselves. They don't have to find their identity based on what everybody around them says or how what they glean from the reactions of people around them or the perceived reactions of the people around them. We can be definitive in who we are. We can be definitive in our identity when we root that in Christ and we hang on to His the fact that we are again crucified in Christ. We belong to Christ, and that all of our being, mental, spiritual, physical, all of it is wrapped up in our identity in Christ. I wanted to bring in a couple thoughts from Merrill Herr from that little chapter he read from Fertile Ground, the little field guide for youth pastors. She says that for teens today, identity has become more about being in tune with oneself than being in tune with others, and this is a real key issue for youth workers, for pastors who are supporting youth workers, or just trying to help families in general. That we live in a culture in the Western world and in a time where we are increasingly individualistic. Not that we haven't been for quite some time, but it just seems to be moving further and further in that direction. And the identity question for most young people right now is being asked as though only their opinion matters, and that's a dangerous thing. And also, it's also a daunting and isolating thing for a teenager, for a 13, 14-year-old young lady, for example, to be asking herself and wrestling with the question of who am I and who am I going to be the rest of my life, um, and 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 believe that they have that responsibility solely and squarely on her own shoulders. What a difficult and overwhelming idea. And so we want to come alongside them and help them see a bigger picture about their identity formation. Um, as Merrill says, that they teenagers are even more likely today in many ways, I think, to experiment with identities, to experiment with people groups, to experiment with sexual identities, which is highly encouraged in most of the circles, the social circles and educational circles that they run in. And so they'll try on different identities and personas and trying to figure out what seems to capture the longings that they have in their hearts. And I think she really astutely helps us to see that as youth pastors, we want to help students understand their identity in those four ways of being intended, being responsible, being accountable, and being together with one another. That we are intended in the sense that God made us on purpose and for a purpose. And that we don't have to try to figure that out. We can let Him reveal that to us, which both gives incredible value and meaning to our lives, and also removes some hopefully some stress and some angst about trying to figure out who we are. And along with that, because of that, we are responsible. That we have work to do here. We are not created for our own glory or pleasure, but for the glory of God, to whom we are responsible for these lives that we have and these bodies that we have. And along with that, we're accountable. That He does, in fact, tell us that that what we do with our bodies, how we understand ourselves, what we do with our lives, these things count. And how we embody who we are matters, not just in terms of whether or not we get into heaven, but in the purpose that God has given us for our lives here on this earth. And again, that we do this together. That we were never intended to do it by ourselves. We can't do it by ourselves, at least not very well. So we want to bring those things to bear in the lives of our teens as they wrestle with their identities. Okay, of course, there's mountains more to talk about when it comes to the topic of identity and identity development, but this just gives us at least a place to start and have some conversations as we move into some questions of sexuality coming up.